Good morning, guys. Today we have lesson 8 in our language arts, and I'm going to do something a little bit different this morning. I am going to try and use my laptop to teach you guys this lesson, and we're going to give it a try. And I have put this lesson into my computer, and I'm going to try and use this instead of my whiteboard to teach you this morning. So, if you have your books and you're ready to follow along, get ready for lesson 8. Today we have dependent and independent clauses and compound and complex sentences, all right? Our objectives in today's lesson is we want to review what our dependent and independent clauses are. We want to define and identify what a compound complex sentence is. And we need to be able to identify whether a sentence is a compound, a complex, or a compound complex sentence, all right? Don't worry, it's not that confusing, all right? So let's get into it. So, do you guys remember what a dependent and independent clause is? Anyone remember? I'll give you guys a couple seconds to think about it. If you answered it without seeing the answer in your book, good job. So remember, a dependent clause begins with a relative pronoun or a subordinating conjunction, all right? It cannot stand alone as a sentence. So here would be an example of a dependent clause. If we'd have the subordinating conjunction when with our sentence, we could say when the volcano erupted, all right? That doesn't make sense on its own. So it's depending upon another part of the sentence. So if we would say, when the volcano erupted, the villagers ran out of town. All right, so that would be depending upon our other sentence, which means it's a dependent clause. An independent clause is a complete thought, and it can stand alone as a sentence. All right, so here, Jan's mom has finished her book. So that is a complete thought, and it can stand alone as a sentence, and it makes sense, right? Jan's mom has finished her book. Also, independent clauses are not introduced by a relative pronoun or subordinating conjunction, all right? Jesus slipped away through the crowd before they could hear him, all right? So here's an example that we're going to do. And for your first part in your lesson today, 1 and 2, you're supposed to bracket the dependent clauses and underline the independent clause. So remember, what does a dependent clause begins with a what? A relative pronoun or a subordinating conjunction. So we need to make sure we know what those are. So in the sentence down here, Jesus slipped away through the crowd before they could harm him. Where is our dependent clause? Where's our subordinating conjunction or our relative pronoun that introduces our dependent clause? Before, right? Before would also be a preposition, but this is a sentence. They could harm him. It contains a subject and a verb. So there's our dependent clause, before they could harm him. And then that means our independent clause is right there. Jesus slipped away through the crowd. All right, so that our independent clause, our clause that is underlined, can stand on its own. It makes sense. Jesus slipped away through the crowd. But if we would just say, before they could harm him, that wouldn't make any sense, would it? So this sentence is depending upon this sentence to make sense. So it's dependent on our independent clause. All right? Hopefully that isn't too confusing. Now, you can go ahead and pause the video and do your first two. You can bracket your dependent clauses and underline your independent clauses. Now we're going to get into our next section in today's lesson, compound complex sentences. So we know that a compound sentence simply has two independent clauses, right? Two sentences that can stand on its own. So here we have, aspirin was originally concocted by Charles Gerhardt. So that makes sense, right? But Felix Hoffman discovered its usefulness 40 years later. So we have two sentences that can stand on their own and that are connected by a conjunction. Remember, our compound sentences are connected by a conjunction. So Moving on to our complex sentence. Remember, our complex sentence has one independent clause, which I have underlined, and then it has one dependent clause that is depending upon the other part of the sentence, which would be, although aspirin was originally concocted by Charles Garhart, so that's depending upon our other part of the sentence. Oops. So that would be our dependent clause. It's introduced by our subordinating conjunction, although, and then it's depending upon our independent clause. Now, what we're learning about today is our compound complex sentence. Although aspirin was originally concocted by Charles Garhart, Felix Hoffmann discovered its usefulness 40 years later. He was searching for a pain reliever for his arthritic father. All right, so a compound complex sentence consists of two or more independent clauses, all right? So it has to be a compound sentence, so it has to have two independent clauses that can stand on their own. And the complex part means it has to have one dependent clause. So here we found our dependent clause, although is our subordinating conjunction, although aspirin was originally concocted by Charles Garhart. And then here's our first independent clause. Felix Hoffmann discovered its usefulness 40 years later. And then our second independent clause would be, he was searching for pain reliever for his arthritic father. So that is what our compound complex sentence is. Our compound sentence only has two independent clauses connected by a conjunction. Our complex sentence has one independent clause and one dependent clause. And our compound complex sentence, compound means it has to have two independent clauses, and then complex means it has to have at least one clause that is depending upon the other two independent clauses. All right? So, in conclusion, today we know that a compound sentence has two or more independent clauses that can stand by themselves. They make sense on their own. A complex sentence is one independent clause and one or more dependent clauses. And a compound complex sentence has two or more independent clauses and one or more dependent clauses. All right, so you have a question to answer on number 3. I'm just gonna whip on over here. Question number 3, and then number 4, you guys are doing the same thing, except make sure you read your directions carefully. And then here, bracket any dependent clauses and underline the independent clauses, all right? Remember, right there, remember that? And then remember this right here. I'm gonna go back to my front. Remember that, these are objectives. A dependent clause has to begin with a relative pronoun or a subordinating conjunction. And a dependent clause does not make sense on its own, all right? And an independent clause is a complete thought and it can stand on its own. Jan's mom has finished her book. All right? That is all for your new part today. I hope you guys have a fantastic Friday, and I will see you guys sometime soon. All right?